It's on this. Hello, I'm Michael Ward. I've been with the Cerebral Palsy Clinic at the Weissman Center for over 20 years now. I'm in the Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation Medicine. Actually, I'm moving next to the Department of Pediatrics under the umbrella here of the core of the clinical work for children with disability. I'm an associate professor, and my interest has been in looking at people with developmental disabilities and acquired brain injuries, and a holistic form, looking at not only the motor disabilities but also the sensory and cognitive and social integration issues that people face with changes in the brain tissue. So the focus today is on the biggest single group of people with cerebral palsy who've had prematurity and periventricular leukomalacia, and diving down into how broadly this condition of periventricular leukomalacia, and I will help you understand what that means, it's a mouthful, how it affects people through the lifespan. So we want to understand this relationship of prematurity. We'll look at MRIs that demonstrate the periventricular leukomalacia and then how that relates to the diagnosis of CP. I want to discuss how the white matter, periventricular leukomalacia, affects the white matter, and talk about some of the new imaging we have to better understand interconnections of brain tissues. And then I want to discuss these broadly affected systems, motor, sensory, cognitive functions that are challenged by periventricular leukomalacia. But we should start by talking about some basic definitions. The face of cerebral palsy is extremely varied. People have many different manifestations and support needs and abilities. So it has a definition. We'll be a little bit of cycling back during our talks today. But consensus definition of cerebral palsy is that it's really a group of disorders. It's not one thing. It has different causes. It has different manifestations. But it's a group of disorders of movement and posture. It's non-progressive. We had a little mention here of degenerative diseases, which are not cerebral palsy. And it's something that happens to a fetal or an infant brain. So it starts with a change in the brain very early in life. The part I want to focus on today is this lower section, though, that the definition of cerebral palsy includes co-occurring problems with sensation, perception, communication, and or behavior, and or seizure disorder. But it's a very broadly manifesting condition. It is defined by having a motor component, but that's only one piece, and I really want to talk a lot about the other pieces. So I'm going to start with talking about this condition, periventricular leukomalacia. Cerebral palsy is always caused by some abnormality in the brain, and the PVL is the largest single contributor to these challenges. It's the most common abnormality to the brain. It's really complex to understand and explain the mechanism of why periventricular leukomalacia occurs, but the newborn brain in children that are premature, weigh a couple of pounds, is very vulnerable in certain areas. So certain pieces of the brain can fall under a cascade of unfortunate events that can cause substantial brain damage. So it's strongly associated with the prematurity and the low birth weight because the brain isn't ready to thrive outside of the womb at that time. So the other concept here, periventricular, refers to these structures of the brain called ventricles. And so these are located in the center of each hemisphere. This picture shows the brain, the eyes would be down here looking forward. This one has the outline of the skull. But these fluid channels where the cerebrospinal fluid flows, it's sort of like, I was just trying to think of an analogy, but I live under an area where there's immense underground rivers. You know, we have this elaborate storm sewer system that's inside there. You never see it, but it's huge and it's flowing all of the time. So we have this kind of a system which does some drainage for the brain tissues deep inside our brain. And the spinal fluid's made in the inside the brain, and then it circulates around the brain. It floats our brain, protects our brain, cleans our brain. And then that fluid flows down the spinal cord. If you have a spinal tap, they're taking a sample of the cerebrospinal fluid. But inside the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid lives in these oddly shaped internal structures deep inside each half of the brain. Those are the ventricles. So the definition of cerebral palsy is that around the ventricles, in this deep tissue of the brain, there's white matter thinning, leukomalacia. So the leuco refers to the white matter. The gray matters, when you look at a brain, it's the curly gyri that you see. That's the gray matter. Inside of that, interconnecting the surface of the brain to everything else, is the white matter. So the white matter's thinner. So thinning of the white matter, particularly in the area around the ventricles, periventricular leukomalacia. From here on, we'll call that PVL. Okay. I like to do talks with long words. I had to do one once on ventilator dependency and spinal epiphyseal dysplasia congenita, which is, but forever in my life, that just rolls off my tongue. It was like a 5-minute presentation, so you got to be able to say it quick. This is a picture of periventricular leukomalacia. So here's a normal brain, and when the white matter thins, well, first you see there's a large increase in this blackened area. That blacker area is the cerebrospinal fluid. So on your left, you see the brain, which has smaller black areas. You see the black areas surround the brain, and then they're in these deep channels, the ventricles, which we're talking about. So when the white matter thins, then something has to take up that space. So the ventricles become larger, and they change shape. So we see this, kind of scalloped shape. And if we can look, here's the best example, I think. If you look here at this little bridge, this is a bridge between the right and the left hemisphere. That's corpus callosum. It's a deep connections of massive numbers of fibers that connect what's going on in the left brain with the right brain. It's very important. When you look at the brain with PVL, you see this is much, much smaller because the white matter's been reduced. It's thinner, so there's much less interconnection there to travel between the left and the right brain. So the PVL is going to affect deep brain connections. Yeah. The other thing in the PVL is you can look at, just this is the white matter, all of these structures, that it has a different density, and it's not like a little thing. It's not a spot. It's very widespread. We see little fingers of the thinning of the white matter spreading out into all parts of the brain. It's wispy, right? So it's not contained, it's broad spread. And I'm going to point out one more thing. It's in the front, and it's in the middle, and it's in the back, okay? It involves the whole brain. And so that's an important point. So we look at people with cerebral palsy, and everybody got a scan. We would see that big chartreuse area is the number who have periventricular leukomalacia. It's by far the largest brain condition underlying cerebral palsy. The second largest is that yellow spot on the bottom, which is they don't have a abnormality. And periventricular is the largest contributor to these various other things. Different things can happen to developing brains that are like strokes or other conditions, developmental malformations. But PVL, we're going to focus on PVL today. So this may not apply to other etiologies. So next I wanted to talk about the relationship between the surface of the brain and this interconnection process, right? So this is a little map of the brain. The one on the left is looking over to the left. The eyes would be just under the brain. And that red part is the motor strip. That houses it's the precentral gyrus, we call that. But it carries the information which comes out of the brain, goes down to the arms and legs, and really helps to generate patterns of movement. Right? So the primary purpose of that red area is to activate arms, legs, and face. And we can map that out. The surface of the brain was mapped out a long time ago, and the fibers from different body parts are located in different regions. We call it the homunculus. So you see the leg is kind of hanging over in the middle. That's the middle of the brain there where the fibers to the leg go. And then the hand is kind of on the upper outside, and then the bottom part is the face, the lips and the tongue. The representation of the homunculus relates to how complicated is that movement, right? So the leg is the strongest and the biggest, but it doesn't have a big representation in the brain because it's not nearly as complicated as what we do with the hand. So something like handwriting is, this is what I was looking for. So that's handwriting is a lot more complex than walking if you really look at the number of neurons that you need. And what gets the most space, it's like the face, our expression, our communication, this rapid articulation to say spinal epiphyseal dysplasia. That was a lot of neurons to signal that motor output, right? So the face gets this huge representation. So it's that's the motor homunculus. That's where our motor signals come from. So when we look at cerebral palsy and periventricular leukomalacia, how is that going to affect, our function? And the issue is the PVL is not really affecting the surface of the brain and where all these different individual functions are. This gray matter where the voluntary motor movement is relatively untouched by periventricular leukomalacia. Okay? But what is affected is this interconnection of the brain, these interconnecting networks. And there's been a lot of progress in getting fantastic imaging of these interconnections. Look at that, right? This is a connectome. This is now imaging. It's diffuser tensor imaging, where we can look at the tracks that connect one part of the brain to the other. And so this is a whole brain image, and they add these, it looks like something you would have seen on Thursday, with a Halloween wig, right? But and this picture doesn't mean a lot more to me. That it's a similar interpretation. I can't interpret these tracks, but we do have a way of looking at this issue of how the brain's connected to itself in a much more detailed way. And so we'll talk a little bit about tracks. So these colors represent groups of neurons that are carrying functions through the brain and relating one piece of the surface of the brain to another piece of the surface of the brain, right? This is a critical issue with periventricular leukomalacia. Okay. So we're going to talk about how these connections, then, the periventricular leukomalacia, affect functions in certain ways. So if we look at that motor strip, wrong device. The leg is over here hanging in the middle, and the face is way over on the side. So when these fibers have to come down, to come out to reach the spinal cord and make movement, those leg fibers are in a less optimal place as far as the periventricular area. They have to go closer to the ventricles. The stuff on the outside, the face, has a different little route, and it's not going to need to run through the ventricular area as intensely. So there's more interruption of the information out from the leg area than there is from the face area. And we see in cerebral palsy relatively less challenge with communication skills in people with periventricular leukomalacia. So it disrupts the connections under the motor area more profoundly because of this more central location. So the leg fibers are running right into that periventricular area more often than the arm fibers. This is a picture of somebody upright there looking forward, this little MRI. It's a different view. So we're looking at them from behind. So spastic diplegia is a more frequent pattern associated with periventricular leukomalacia. Diplegia is involvement of the legs, that the legs have more motor impairment than the arms. So if we're looking at a modern population where we have excellent prenatal care and many very small babies survive, we see the manifestations of diplegia fairly commonly, right? But it's not that simple, because periventricular leukomalacia also underlies other patterns. So if the periventricular leukomalacia is really broad, it's going to catch all of the fibers. So the hands will have a lot of impairment also, as will even the voice and the articulation and the posture. So PVL is also the most common underlying brain abnormality for people with arm and leg involvement, quadriplegia, 4 pieces. And the PVL that can be very asymmetric. So there can be a whole load of PVL on the left side, and by chance, the right side of the brain doesn't have as much. So that person would have more of a hemiplegic pattern. And then you can get every combination. You can have very asymmetric PVL where the legs are really involved on both sides, but only the left arm. And so you can have every variation of these combinations of body parts, all related to PVL. Just really, the only thing that doesn't happen is sparing of the legs. But here's the most important point I want to make today. So we discussed cerebral palsy in terms of the motor disability. We see the motor disability early, we start early treatment, but the rest of the manifestation of the PVL is very late to emerge. But it in no way is limited to this little piece under the motor strip. And in fact, if you look at these MRIs like this one, there's a lot more concern in the bottom part, which is back toward vision, the sensory part of the brain, right? The part in the front is a little less affected. So the PVL is everywhere in this MRI. And if the PVL, for example, involves a lot of the tissue more in the front, if we looked at this area and we have these big tracts, this massive long tracts, you can see that they go long distances to pull the brain together. This is the area which organizes the human being, and the manifestation really common in PVL is attention deficit disorder. People have difficulties with concentration, organization. So another big manifestation of PVL, independent of the motor, is ADD, which is common among people with prematurity. And you could have the ADD without the CP, or you could have it concurrent with the CP, which is what we are dealing with frequently in the CP clinic. And if the tissue's in the back, as it frequently, abnormal tissues in the back, as we see all the time, just looking at these scans over decades, it's just, you get to appreciate that the motor system may actually be less often involved. We haven't been doing good measurements of that fact, but by just scanning these scans over the years, that there's very often fairly profound PVL underlying the sensory areas of the brain. And I'm going to talk, and if we look at people with cerebral palsy, do they have sensory problems? Hearing loss, a little less involved, but visual impairments and kind of body sense, tactile impairments, extremely common. They're the generally, people with CP do have visual and body sense impairments. So visual perceptual skill development and sensory processing frequently very different for people with cerebral palsy. So I'm going to talk about something here. What's this? A little ball. So there's a massive stream. This is the ventral stream that comes from the area of your brain where you have vision down to the area where you store the words, where you recognize what things are, the knowing. It's the ventral stream, right? As an example of just something that's massively connected, right? Your eyes to your language area. And then I'm going to try to toss, oh, good catch. Notice that Mary from OT, that's our team from the CP, is not shouting, it's a ball, it's a ball. As it comes to her, the hands move. And there's a completely separate from knowing, there's a whole set of interconnections that align your hands, not only the object's coming, you know how fast it's coming, you know how big it is, and your whole body prepares with this other piece of interconnections, another massive system. These are showing these interconnection webs, right? There's the dorsal stream, so she was thinking about what it was, but ventral stream, coming up to the dorsal stream, which gets your body prepared to do the motor activity, right? And so there are people that could catch the ball and use the ball, throw it, but can't name what it is, then there might be another group of people that damage the ventral stream that can't tell you what it is. They can't find the word, but they could use it, right? So a lot of these interconnections are independent of one another. It's not an all or nothing. It's which piece of the interconnection is of higher quality than the other. Very complicated, but I think those dorsal and ventral streams help to really illustrate some of the issues related to connectivity. Of these, under the deep brain connection areas of the white matter, the language system has been studied most intensively. There are a lot of nice pictures about the connection between Wernicke's area sensory speech and Broca's area motor speech. And in people with CP, we really essentially never see people with aphasia, like you would see with somebody to damage of one of these areas from a stroke. And these language-dominant areas are involving shorter connection tracks, is the point I was trying to illustrate. So the connection, for example, between these two huge language areas is relatively short, compact, and little. And it doesn't dive down toward the ventricle. It stays closer to the surface. So we see with periventricular leukomalacia very little interruption of speech, of communication skills, of fluency. If that area is damaged also in a developing brain, this is a whole nother talk, but it moves to the other side. So there's a second reason why we hardly ever see aphasia kind of things with children with CP. But so the left brain, or the language dominant side of the brain, tends to use shorter, less volume in these white tracks, so less affected by the PVL. So the right brain and the left brain have different patterns of connectivity. And what we find is that the PVL much more profoundly injures the functional requirements of the right brain than of the left brain. So the left brain is relatively spared, the language functions, but the important functions of the right brain are particularly vulnerable. So these functions of the right brain are these integrative, right, deductive, organizing features of the brain. They process a very complex visual and spatial material, and these areas, particularly the parietal lobe highlighted in that picture, are extremely dependent on the white matter. In fact, they're defined by white matter, essentially. So the right brain has a lot more challenge. And it's a hard area to understand. What do I have a right parietal lobe? What is even that for? Because it's hard to map out. It doesn't map like so nice, like listening is here and speech is there. It's a very integrated system. But some of the things that we see with challenges in the parietal lobe, like where is my body? Like how is my my arm, my posture related to the floor, to gravity? How do my clothes feel on my body? Am I paying attention to that or not? Where's your body in relationship to that seat that you're using, right? How is my body related to what I'm seeing? How will I get through the door and negotiate space? What is my relationship? It's all about these relationships, right? Your body, your chair, but also like, why are we here? Why do we care to, gather together and relate to each other to learn about cerebral palsy? Yeah. And how is my behavior like coming here related to my core values? How are we related to each other? Not just physically, but also psychologically and emotionally. So pulling the pieces all together. So, what are possible manifestations of loss of this parietal connectivity? These sensory, you can kind of pick this up from what I'm talking about, sensory processing. We all know the challenges of young people with sensory processing disorders. Clumsiness, social awkwardness, right? If you have a lot to say, but you don't know when to put it in the conversation. So maybe a good vocabulary, but challenges with how to use my vocabulary for effective communication. And this population of people who have a lot of difficulties can feel very disorganized and overwhelmed, have tremendous anxiety and other emotional problems. The next speaker is going to be more detailed in talking about these more psychological components. Right? So these perceptions are really important for daily life function, but they're hard to measure. And essentially in a 2-year-old, we don't have anything to measure. right? As children get older, as a routine in the cerebral palsy clinic, we will look at people's ability to use complex vision and determine which of these match. But you need to be a little older before you can start to really get down in assessments that give us information. So we start in the CP clinic with 7-year-olds. We can start getting this information much richer by 8 and 9. And as the children get older, we would send them to Dr. Mission, and we get more detailed neuropsychometric assessment to understand in greater detail the effects of this congenital lesion, right, on how your cognition is developing as a whole. I'm going to make another last point in summary about. So we talked about how complicated these issues are, right? And how the manifestations are different. And if we look at children with diplegia who had problems there with the motor strip, the precentral gyrus, they're all going to get treatment. We're going to see the ankle tightness, and we'll do maybe Botox treatments or a brace and send the child to physical therapy. We have universal health care coverage for this population of people, right? If it's in the front and we have ADD, there are pills for that. Whether or not you should take them is complex. I talked a little bit about the disorganizing back here, and it's hard to tell sometimes in children with CP on whether the focus problem is more on I'm so disorganized or I have such weak attention. So that's, again, a neuropsychology point to sort out, right? But we have treatment, and, most people come around to talking about treatment, at least for children with poor attention, right? It's noticeable. Then we come back, if you had stuff way in the back and had some visual integration problems, that might be noted. Maybe there's a pattern of dyslexia that affects school achievement. It's not so hit you in the face. It's not so obvious. So the school districts potentially, through vision support services may pick that up and provide support to its student, right? And then we get to this one, with the clumsy kid who's socially inappropriate and they're off task. And this one, the primary intervention, this is my little discussion I give with medical students all the time. This one's managed by the principal. Because you're not behaving the way we want. And you can get punished for having that disability. So if you look at our service delivery system, and there are treatments for this. It comes in OT, and can you get medical assistants to pay for this service? You can get, probably 100 PT visits for one for sensory processing, right? So there's a discrimination against pieces of the brain, is my point on that. And it just, understanding that periventricular oligomalacia is one thing. It affects the brain from the front to the back, yet we discriminate heavily in medical insurance support as to which section your brain is having the trouble with. Right? And we give you less service for one piece over the other. So that was my point. We try to be full service in our clinic and look at all of these pieces together, which is why it's a multidisciplinary clinic, right? If we're only able to look at mechanics of movement, we're going to miss the majority of the issues that need to be addressed for people with CP. So did I talk too long? Yeah, I thought that was 20 minutes, but it took a little longer. Should we do 5 minutes here, and then any questions that you want to ask about that? I know that's a brain full of information. It feels like this, right? Yes. Everything. But, we store our words down there too, but it's sort of the whole sense of recognition. That would go, facial recognition goes in there, word, retrieval, finding the word for an object. It's the sense of knowing. I know what that is, right? Using vision to knowing. And vision to doing would be going up toward those sections which pull the body parts together for action, right? So that's a little on the outside of the brain over here. Yeah, I think that's a helpful concept. I mean, it just gives a sense of what these streams, these interconnections are doing. Can we see these on here? Not really. You can see the ventral stream easily. Dorsal stream is not well imaged there. Yeah.
This might be a little bit of a juvenile question, just given.
Not possible. Okay.
But, so how would HIE be connected to PBL?
Yeah,
Or
so,
how-
yeah, HIE is going to be sort of, well, most of the time the opposite, okay? In that it's going to affect the gray matter much more than the white matter, right? So like I said, HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, is lack of oxygen delivery to the brain cells. And the gray matter cells, they're gigantic. So that type of injury is going to affect the biggest cells the worst. So it's a lot harder on the gray matter than the white matter, right? And it's harder on certain pieces of the gray matter than certain other pieces of the gray matter, right? So it has its own syndrome. But it really is a very different pattern. That would be the contrast pattern.
So you mentioned prematurity and low birth weight as precursors or risk factors for
To the PBL.
What else would be a precursor?
You know, some people just have PBL and we didn't know, and it maybe developed when they were in development. They hadn't been born and something happened which was critical at that same stage, like the 7th month, right? So we see that, you know. The other interesting thing, though, is that if you have like a stroke-like event, I'll try to make this brief, and you damage the right hemisphere, you're going to have a lot of the same psychological, spatial problems. But the other interesting thing is you damage the left hemisphere in maybe a second trimester, mid-gestation. Then you damage the language areas. Those language areas pack up. They move over to the right hemisphere, and guess what? The right hemisphere loses again. So the right hemisphere is always the short end of the stick, with right hemisphere damage, left hemisphere damage, with just one hemisphere damage, and PBL, right? It also happens with hydrocephalus and radiation. So these white matter challenges to children with disability are a very large group. So I emphasize there, but yeah. Well, and again, if you know, myself, the CP team, the neuropsychologists, this is our job, is to try to help people differentiate, like, where are you having a problem? Not what is the general problem, but, you know, and try to provide more specific treatment.
How did you get that image of brain?
This one? Yeah, this is called diffuse intention imaging, but it's, so I don't know the MRI technique that allows them to see this, right? But yeah, do you know the answer on that, DTI? On how you actually get the picture of the tracks?
So it has something to do with workflow or
Yeah.
technical work orientation. And these long tracks, if you think about it, they're like lines or tubes. So it forces you more freedom along that directional orientation.
So the MRIs actually pick up water, and because it's magnetic, right? And so if it looks at the contrast between things that are watery and things that are fatty in the brain. There's a lot of fat in the brain. Anyway, that's how they work with the technology to get that, and so they can visualize these strands of nerves. It's pretty cool, though, isn't it? Yeah.
That's artificial color. That's not the real color.
Well, it's not really that color. You notice all the colors were different, right? Like this bright red. So they pick the color they want for the structure. So it's not really that pretty in there. Are we good?
I think there's one more question there, and that'll be the last question.
More of a comment. You're hearing about the neurodegenerative versus progressive versus kind of static changes. As somebody who lives with somebody who has PBL, I would say that definitely CP is not neurodegenerative, but I wouldn't say that it isn't progressive.
Or changing, the word I say.
Yeah, because life is progressive.
Right. So,
It's good for families to know some of these processing issues. But the principle, taking care of stuff, the vision, you sort of see this come out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
As people grow older, so I wouldn't say it's progressive, but
But-
spasticity has long-term.
point home. Thank you.
Would it be fair then to say that the brain is more or less static in this injury, but the exactly.
Yeah,
where it's
because 5-year-olds are not doing algebra. If that's your disability, it's manifest when you're 12. Do you get it? And so it is different for adults. And then the adult world is even that much more complicated when you're responsible for your personal financial management, and that's perhaps not available to you. So again, this is our progression today, is to try to talk more about that. So we have next, are you introducing? You know where to go with that? I tried. Well, I read we're in the dorsal, in the ventral stream.
Yes, we're in the ventral. And then just to mention, in your programs, you have more information about each of our speakers. On the back, there's bios included for all of our presenters today. And Dr. Ward will also remain on the clinician panel, so if there were any lingering questions that weren't covered as part of his presentation, he'll be part of the clinician community panel. But now let's welcome Dr. Paige Mission.
So that was a perfect segue into what I'm going to be touching on, and thank you for your comment as a parent. So we'll come back to that. So my intention here is to briefly go over the diversity of how cerebral palsy presents, what neuropsychology has contributed to our understanding of the disorder, and talk a little bit about some resources that are available. Dr. Ward has gone over a lot of these early slides that I have here, so to just kind of graze through these. Cerebral palsy really has initially been conceptualized as a disorder of motor movement, and it's quite diverse in how it presents, as Dr. Ward touched on, and a lot of that does have to do with where the insult or injury is in the context of the connectivity in the brain with the white matter. But increasingly what we have come to realize is that the type of injury and the extent of the injury really does affect not only our understanding of how motor movement is impacted, but also broader kind of cognitive implications, social emotional implications. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, there is a lot of different types of injuries, types of insults that an individual could present with. Certainly, the periventricular leukomalacia is the most common presentation of what we see in terms of injury and sort of brain difference in individuals with cerebral palsy. Bax has done a tremendous job with collecting data and information to inform our understanding of how cerebral palsy presents and what really the diversity is. Increasingly, what we are coming to appreciate is what those non-motor components of cerebral palsy really are, and how do we intervene and support individuals to really promote independency and resiliency. We talked a little bit about the condition as being static, non-progressive. I would say that is a term that we use in differentiating how cerebral palsy is from, for example, cancer, where a tumor might be growing and impacting, kind of encroaching on different brain regions. This does not mean that the disability does not change, does not further impact functioning and outcomes. I would say a conversation that I often have with families is where we're doing, repeated neuropsychological evaluations over the course of the child's life, and we're seeing children or individuals kind of grow into deficits, so to speak. And so in that context, we need to continue to update intervention programming, educational planning, and really our expectations for how to support, again, that and build that independence and that resiliency. So ongoing monitoring, ongoing programming is really, really important. And so, in the same way, I think when we think about any child, and particularly children with disabilities, it's really important to take a holistic approach, a holistic perspective, considering not only biologically, sort of structurally what is going on, but what have the opportunities been to promote learning. And then what is the environment like? What is the environment like at home? What is the environment like at school? What is the environment like out in the community? How many opportunities does this individual have really to learn and to develop those skills? And how is that being fostered? And, at the core of that, too, what we're talking about is mental health and how that all kind of brings it together. I want to briefly go over what we often see are some common neurocognitive presentations and profiles in individuals with cerebral palsy. It is a presentation where oftentimes, not always, but often we see when there is more motor impairment, there's also some more cognitive difficulties that the individual experiences. And yes, there certainly are some structural explanations for that. There are some biological explanations for that. But as Dr. Ward kind of alluded to, when there is less of an opportunity to explore one's environment because one is more physically restricted, it's harder to learn. So then, and our brain develops through learning and kind of exercising that muscle. So a lot of those, not only where there might be some poor connectivity, for example, in those different parts of the brain, like the parietal lobe, as Dr. Ward talked about, then there's less of an opportunity to continue to kind of grow that muscle and grow those abilities and those skills, and that can make it then just that much more difficult for the individual to keep up with peers. As we talked about, language is something that is often preserved. The brain's an incredible organ. It does almost everything it possibly can to preserve language, because that's a pretty critical way that we communicate. So often reorganization will happen. For individuals with cerebral palsy, we often see memory being intact as well. It very much depends on where the injury is and what the ultimate presentation is. But those are areas that we often see as being pretty intact, and those we can very readily build off of and kind of support those strengths. Often what we do see, though, are some substantial difficulties with visual, perceptual, understanding, recognition, and that can look like impacting writing skills, that can look like impacting math skills, and that certainly, when we think about what is required for driving and understanding how to park a car in a parking space, kind of thinking about understanding how much we can anticipate the space that we have and then move into that space. So providing, and I certainly would agree that occupational therapy is one of the most tremendous and powerful interventions that we can offer families and kids with this visual spatial, these visual spatial difficulties. And it additionally, we often see attention issues and something called executive dysfunction happening. Those executive functioning abilities are much more located in the front part of the brain. And if we are seeing some brain differences, some disorder going on in sort of the center of the brain, right? That's where we saw those ventricles located. That's where we saw a lot of that white matter disruption happening. Then that front part of the brain is really going to take a hit. So it's going to be harder to plan ahead, to know where to start with something, know how to finish something. Even consistently have the motivation or the interest or the desire to follow through, and also advocate for oneself. I think that is something that individuals often struggle with, and then they're seen as lazy or as being kind of naughty, and that's not, that's kind of missing the fact that there are some brain differences that we need to figure out how to meet these individuals where they're at. So again, kind of coming back to taking this very holistic approach in how we're working with individuals and having care provided in the context of multidisciplinary clinics too, where we are including physicians, where we're including OT, PT, social work, psychology, really can be quite powerful. So this, in thinking about what those profiles look like, what the neurocognitive profiles often look like, we have over time developed a specific name sort of for what these profiles are. And again, to kind of just go to then how do we intervene for these individuals, this profile has not been formally documented in the DSM, for example, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used as sort of a Bible for psychology, for psychiatry, and really helps to facilitate service delivery ultimately. So this nonverbal learning disability, or NVLD, NLD, really does capture the fact that these individuals have trouble with the visual perceptual integration, visual perceptual understanding and processing, which is very much related to that dorsal stream that we were talking about, kind of that top connection. Difficulty with kind of psychomotor movements, and then some difficulties with learning, and then also some social awkwardness, some kind of social clumsiness that can sometimes look like some mild symptoms of almost autism at times. So difficulty, maintaining friends, starting friendships, keeping friendships. So all of that is really captured in this NVLD, NLD profile. What we know helps is, especially for children who are school age, so elementary school, middle school, high school, is really developing a special education program. And then getting connections with outpatient OT, and then having some structured opportunities to really practice some of those social skills. So what is one way that we can sort of facilitate treatment and therapy and support individuals with cerebral palsy? Getting neuropsychological evaluations done is something that has been very useful and helpful for families. The field of neuropsychology is first and foremost founded in psychology, so those of us who are in this practice are clinical psychologists first and foremost, and then we've pursued some additional training in neuroanatomy and medically complicating conditions. The neuropsychological evaluation, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, consists of, it's all paper pencil based, so we don't do any imaging or scans or anything like that. We'll use what physicians obtain, but it's all paper pencil. The amount of testing or the amount of time that it can take can be anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. It could be over the span of 1 day or 2 days. And after the testing, you would get a final report, and we would go over the results with you that you could then share with school. What you can expect in a neuropsychological report is a pretty comprehensive evaluation, a pretty comprehensive overview of what's going on with how the child thinks and learns, and what resources we would recommend that could be helpful to support, again, that independence and that resiliency. When I talk about resiliency, I'm really talking about how do we promote a sense of self-confidence, a sense of self-efficacy. How do we teach that child that when things are hard, they're able to kind of pick themselves up, use their resources, advocate for themselves. So those are common goals, because I think sometimes it can be pretty overwhelming to know where to start or how to get going with resources and services. So kind of just keeping those buckets in mind, I think, can be helpful for families. I do want to note, too, from neuropsychological evaluations, as a field, we're housed in kind of the medical community. And the medical world is different from the educational world, and I'll talk about the educational world in a moment here. And we can talk further at the end of my talk if you have any questions about navigating services or anything like that. But what we see in the testing that we do sometimes is accepted by school, sometimes is not. And if it's not, we can talk about how to kind of navigate advocating for services and getting services set up. But I think it's important to kind of just keep in mind that they're two separate buckets. From a neuropsychological evaluation, we can, and this is a long list of recommendations, but we can get a lot of not only information about how the child learns and how the child retains information and processes the world, but we can get down into some very specific recommendations that could be helpful, that school could be doing, that could be done by parents or caregivers at home. Oftentimes, given a lot of the visual perceptual deficits and difficulties that individuals with cerebral palsy experience, not only including OT, but also providing individuals with the opportunity to use keyboards, to have sort of a modified writing curriculum, and to start teaching talk to text. I don't know how many of you use that in your phones, but it is definitely a skill to develop. It's not something that's necessarily easy to do, because when you do talk and dictate, then you're also having to edit and review what it is that you just dictated. So kind of starting that skill sooner rather than later can be helpful in kind of refining that ability so that individuals aren't having to rely so much on tasks of writing. So I'm going to jump over into special education and just offer some resources with how to navigate services here. There are a few different ways that individuals can receive special education, and myself and my colleagues came up with these slides here to offer to families and providers to just give some guidance here. So a 504 plan is kind of like special education light. There are not dollars attached to it, and it provides accommodations rather than more kind of specific therapies, for example, OT, PT, speech. Certainly with any special education services, passing grades are not guaranteed, and depending on the school district, updating the 504 plan or the special education service will consistently be a part of the process. The schools do have the right to stop a 504 plan at any time or stop special education services at any time if they have determined that the child is making adequate academic progress. Health service plans are often very helpful to have for students with complicating medical conditions. They really do formalize access to nursing staff for children to be able to access the school in a more accessible way, to be able to take medications as needed, to be able to take breaks, and to not have that held against them. So having all of these kind of documented and written down really does make a difference. Oftentimes teachers will give the services out of the goodness of their hearts or because they're, they understand the process or they understand teaching in a way that services a very broad classroom, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So having it documented and formalized can help to kind of make sure that we're reinforcing and reminding those who are working with the students of what the student needs. There's a lot, so when we get to the point of establishing an IEP or an individualized education plan, there's a lot of different types of educational labels. In the medical world, we use, like I said, this big book called the DSM. And that's where, ADHD is housed if we were to move forward with diagnosing an anxiety disorder or depression, autism or a learning disorder, dyslexia, dyscalculia. In the educational world, these are the terms that will be used. So while there is some overlap, there's also some differences here. Oftentimes, individuals with cerebral palsy will kind of fall under the other health impairment bucket. Children with ADHD could also fall in that bucket. And then we kind of go from there in terms of tailoring what the plan looks like. In terms of making a referral, doing it in writing is really important. And I would be happy to send this to anyone. We created a mock-up of a letter that can be submitted to school. By submitting the request in writing, that ensures that the school will take the next steps with starting the evaluation or following up with the evaluation. Having a timestamp is really important because once that written note is received, then that starts the clock with getting services set up. Just having an informal conversation doesn't necessarily get things started. So this written request is really important. Your primary care doc or physician can't kind of write a script or write a note or write in a request for an IEP. It does have to come from the school as to whether or not they decide to establish those services. A physician can certainly help with helping you to construct the letter to send to the school. But just as you're navigating services, I think it's just an important piece to keep in mind. So like I said, there is, by having the written request, it starts the clock and gets services moving. So a school must respond within 15 business days once that request is made. And then the school has 60 calendar days to conduct the evaluation, and then if the student is found eligible for an IEP, they have 30 calendar days to develop an IEP. So you don't need to keep track of all of those numbers, but I just want to kind of drive home the point that there is a clock and that schools are legally required to follow through in a timely manner with getting services set up. The key for qualifying for services is that the educational performance is adversely affected, so that's a really important part. There sort of needs to be to be some sort of academic difficulty, deficit, failure seen in order for those services to be provided. Should families have difficulty getting services set up, I just want to bring to your attention the fact that there are advocates out there who can help you navigate those services. Again, I would be happy to send any of these numbers or information to families. I think going into a special education meeting, going into school, asking for services, I think it can be quite daunting. It can kind of feel like a few against many. So having someone who can be there, who knows special education law, who can help advocate for families, I think is really, really important. I do also just want to briefly touch on guardianship and reevaluations. From a neuropsychological perspective, we would recommend doing a reevaluation every 3 to 4 years. As Dr. Ward mentioned, we can really start getting pretty substantial information about learning and processing and academic skills at 8 years of age. That's when our batteries really start to develop, and that's very much correlates with how the brain is developing and coming online, and what the expectation is by 8 and what we typically see in terms of how the child is able to process information and learn. Guardianship is often something that families will pursue, and I do just want to note that it's important to start this process before the child's 18th birthday. Neuropsychology is certainly happy to help with this process. Oftentimes, in order to establish guardianship, we need to see some sort of cognitive or neurocognitive deficit and document that. I say often because if there's other complicating factors such as autism, then we're able to kind of go through a different avenue with establishing guardianship. And again, I would be happy to send any of these resources to families to help get that process started, or just to have these available for you to start thinking about. And again, some more resources. I know we have some time today to go over questions. Should you have any more specific questions, or be interested in, think that, pursuing a neuropsychological evaluation would be helpful, you can give our clinic a call here. I have our number down here. We also have a fantastic educational resource in our clinic, and would be happy to connect you with her too, if you're receiving services at UW. So I know I'm a little bit over time, but that's about what I had today. I don't know if we have time for questions, or if we should wait until the next. Okay.
Do you think if a child gets practice at learning, the brain will get better at learning?
If a child is able to practice more, will the brain get better at learning? I would say the more opportunities that we do have to practice, the more opportunities that there is to engage in community and in school, absolutely. I think that the brain, kind of like any muscle, the more you go to the gym, the stronger you get, the more you have the opportunity to practice and learn, the stronger that brain gets too. Yeah.
A question, you mentioned that children cannot qualify for OT and PT services on a 504 plan. That's not, I see kids on a 504 plan all the
You see
time.
kids, oh, great, okay.
That's
Great.
actually, so can I just kind of clarify a little bit
Yeah,
on
yeah,
school-based OT?
yeah.
504 plans are really about access. It's not special ed light. It's really more about access to regular education. And I love seeing kids on 504 plans, because those are my high-flying kiddos who just need some help, some support, some services to make sure that they can access all of their regular education services, whether it's that they need assistive technology, or they need, like I just did something to modify a bathroom door in our school district so that the child could access the bathroom. So just to clarify for everybody, if you have a student who has a health impairment or some sort of impairment that impacts their ability to access regular education, those are the kids who qualify for 504 plans, who
Great.
really can get the school-based OT and PT services. So, and also just, coming into IEP meetings, we never want parents to feel overwhelmed. My kids go to the same school that I work in. I come at it from a parental perspective as well. We don't want families coming in feeling overwhelmed by that IEP team. And I always tell my parents, if you have questions, reach out, I'm there. I have 57 students on my caseload, and I touch base with almost all of my parents at least once every other week. So we really try to make sure that kids are getting equal access to their education, and that parents aren't feeling like they need to come in with an advocate, that we can sit down and talk and be part of the team together, and that if kids aren't qualifying for special ed, if there's an underlying impairment, that we're going to see them for some community services under a 504 plan. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah,
What you're saying, but
can we send all children to your school?
I think it's the nice thing about working in a smaller rural school district, where we get to know our families. And I just called a family yesterday and said, your kid is doing amazing, and it's so fun to see the progress. And we want to have that kind of relationship with families. I don't want families coming in and sitting at that IEP table feeling anxious or nervous. We'd rather be like, hey, how's it going? And what can we do to support your kid?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for bringing this up. I think the range of what school districts, individual schools within districts are able to provide, and having worked in schools for many years myself, I've seen the spectrum of things, and I think it's good to reiterate. So schools can, at times, provide these additional OT services, additional PT services, additional speech services under a 504 plan. What it really is about is meeting with the school, figuring out what resources are available and where the school is able to meet you. I love hearing stories about families feeling connected, feeling supported, feeling like there's good home, school communication. That's one of the first questions that I'm asking. And if there's not, certainly it's never the goal to create a more contentious relationship. It's just about figuring out what are the right questions to ask if I'm not getting the services or I'm confused or I'm not sure about. And it's wonderful when there are folks in schools who are really able to take that time. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I appreciate
That's
that.
all right, I
Yeah.
didn't mean to disagree.
No,
Because
no, I
know
think that's
that
wonderful.
people who are looking
Yeah.
at 504 plan, please do, and please ask those questions about OT and PT services, because we definitely can see kids under a 504 plan. Kids just can't get speech therapy under a 504 plan. That's a separate disability that falls in the same key category, but OT and PT most definitely they can, so.
Why is that next to accountability?
So we have another question over here? Oh, yeah.
It's not a related, it depends on if it's a related service or a service category on its own. If a student qualifies for an IEP under the guise of speech, then that's an area, a qualifying area. OT and PT are a related service. It's a related service that supports the academic goals. And our district does not do OT and PT on a 504.
And
Very
that's
rare, yeah,
fascinating to me.
I work in a very large school district, and we can consult, with regular ed team and families, but we aren't allowed, well, maybe able is a bad word, to provide direct on a 504. We can help develop it, we can consult, but direct service isn't on a 504.
So I think, what we're seeing is just the diversity of what school districts are able to offer. So having meetings, seeing, okay, even I've seen on 504 plans where speech can be consulted, but it's not seen as a formalized service in the way that special education label would then delineate or send out speech services. So, for our parents out there, I think having a conversation with a teacher, having a conversation with a school psychologist, having a conversation with someone in the special education kind of group at the school is a good place to start exploring what is possible. Because it's pretty diverse in terms of what can be offered and what's available. So, yeah, thank you. Yes.
So as we approach the end of high school, we have had people really encourage us to take one more neuropsych eval. And I'm wondering, is there ever a time or a situation where you don't gain additional information? Like, is there a time to stop doing that?
So the brain is certainly developing into the 20s. I think at the point, it really depends on what the goals are, I would say. So if the goals are post-secondary schooling and trying to establish services, if the goals are to kind of update programming, if things are just not progressing in a way that is making sense, or you're needing some extra information, extra guidance, I think that's a good tell to pursue getting an updated evaluation. Pursuing guardianship, for example, is a good reason to get updated neuropsych testing. But to just get it because it's the thing to do, I wouldn't say that makes sense. There have to kind of be some goals or some reasons or some things that you're trying to really answer and unearth and, potentially get access to resources to make it make sense. Does that make sense? Okay. You do one more question? Okay.
I have a question. When you were describing neuropsych testing, it sounded like any individual with CP could participate in that. Is there any research that looks at the percentage of individuals with CP who can actually complete neuropsych testing, given that some individuals are nonverbal or would not be able to do the handwriting?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So we do have ways of adapting and modifying the testing. For example, we have IQ tests that are completely nonverbal that we would be able to do with children. Certainly, some of the testing would be limited if with motor motor impairments, but we would be able to do some of it. What I would say would be the best course, we put our hands on every single referral that comes into our service. So having, and we do require a medical referral be made. So having a pediatrician or a nurse practitioner or a primary care doc send over a referral, we'll take a look at the profile and see if we're able to do the testing, and if not, then figuring out how to send the family to somewhere else for next steps to get resources.
Because in my experience as a parent, it seems that the testing can become invalid if you change it or adapt it so much for an individual. And I think it's a huge problem with CP that there aren't tests available for people who are more significantly involved. So that we don't really often get accurate test results in this domain.
Okay, okay. Yeah, and I think certainly because the testing is paper pencil based, you know, we're limited with what we can do. And ultimately, if we're not able to actually do that testing, then going to the place of figuring out what resources to get connected with. But thank you for sharing that experience. I appreciate that.
Thank you. So I just want to let you know about some changes to our schedule going forward than what might have originally been published. We're going to take a brief break where we'll begin in like a brief 5 to 7 minute break so that we can stay as close to our scheduled time as possible for our next presentation by Liz Hecht. But then typically we have a community panel that is after our clinician panel, and today we're combining both. So it'll be a clinician and community panel that will take place right after Liz Hecht's presentation. But if you want to take a brief break, maybe 5 minutes or so, and then join us back in here, we'll resume then with Liz's presentation.
as have access to lots of different kinds of opportunities to make decisions, and to help prepare kids to be self-determined. And kids are really hardwired. I mean, adolescence is all about pushing families away, right? Or pushing parents away, and establishing that young adults' sort of ability to guide their own lives and make their own decisions, whatever the quality of those decisions might be. And we know that kids with disabilities have fewer opportunities to do that than their typically developing peers. So I think in the session before, someone asked a question about, can we continue, do brains continue to develop and decision-making get better? And I think probably, I would say throughout our entire lives, we learn from the opportunities to make decisions and to make mistakes. So some of the things to think about with kids are, how do we find those opportunities for kids with disabilities that their typically developing peers might have access to? So what are for young kids, the opportunity to do sleepovers or go to a friend's house or stay late after school. And then that brings up all sorts of opportunities to figure things out and develop some confidence around decision-making. As kids get older, are there other community activities, after-school clubs, work shadowing experiences that might help facilitate decision-making for young adults? What kinds of community activities do they have access to? And as a parent of a child with CP, I know it was really, really hard to do those things because my son needed 24/7 support. And so how do we have the opportunity to have our kids do things without us so they have those opportunities? And how do we then, as parents, have those opportunities to experience that decision-making on the part of our kids and develop our own comfort level with that and confidence in our kids' ability to make decisions? So thinking about that can be really helpful as we think about what the future looks like for our kids. And families may ask for help in thinking about how do we set up those experiential opportunities to make decisions. So it could be as simple as thinking about or getting some guidance around what are the things you do in your own home that you might offer decision-making opportunities, as simple as choosing clothes. So my son couldn't care less what he was dressed in and what he looked like. So when I held up the blue t-shirt and the red t-shirt, he had absolutely no opinion. But nonetheless, there might have been some, there were other things that we could be thinking about. But even from a really young age, what are those building blocks for decision-making so that young adults have that experience of in a sense, being self-determined in whatever aspect of their life they might be invited to do that. And then the last part I want to mention is this idea of tolerance for risk. So again, I think for parents here who may have teenagers, we know that our teenagers have a much greater tolerance for risk than their parents might have. But it's something that we all need an opportunity to explore. So these are pictures of my family, and when our kids are small, we hold them closely and we protect them, and our role is very different than it is as they get older. One of the things we were always worried about with my son was his ability to navigate safely in the community, and he seemed to have a particular affinity for culverts, and he more than once, and no matter how wide the road was, drove his chair off the side of the driveway and turned it over in a culvert. And this happened in a number of different settings. So not that I want him to have I wanted him to have the opportunity. That wasn't the consequence that I was looking for. But it gave both of us a greater sense of trust in each of our ability to explore what the community had to offer and to take some of those risks. So thinking about that as a family and as those who supports families is really important because we're all worried about different things. But probably health and safety is way up there for most families, not necessarily for young adults. So exploring what are we worried about and what does that look like can be really helpful. So this is a conversation particularly important in the context of what happens when young adults turn 18. So under the law, all young people are legally considered an adult. They're presumed to be able to make decisions, manage their own affairs, enter into contracts, join the military, vote, marry, all kinds of different things. And that presumption isn't any different for someone with a disability. So if we are anticipating that a young adult might need decision-making supports, we want to be aware of what the range of options might be and to be thinking about this ahead of time in terms of what we think that might look like and what we want to do. So some of the things that families and those who support families can do to help is to start the conversation before a young adult turns 18. So just ask the family, have you thought about whether or not your young adult might need decision-making supports, and what are you thinking about in that regard? If you have access to information, it's a really nice time to share it. Physicians, school personnel are probably one of the most important places where families have contact with professionals who might be able to help with this conversation. So think about what information you might be able to share, and at the end of the presentation is a list of resources, both from a medical perspective and from sort of a community living perspective that you might be able to share with families. And as I was talking about, think about what are these learning opportunities, skill-building opportunities that young adults can start to be participating to build self-advocacy skills, to explore self-determination, so that we can all get a better sense of what those decision-making abilities look like. So a lot of the discussion about supported decision-making in a national context is a reaction to guardianship. We've seen a steady increase in guardianship for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, even in the context of growing access to inclusive community opportunities, inclusive school opportunities, inclusive work opportunities. So there's been a really strong reaction and this sort of growing movement to really explore a much greater range of decision-making supports than guardianship. At the same time, we know that families are getting information which is guiding them in that direction more often than any other decision-making type of option. So for example, if you think about the people and places that families are going to be having conversations like this, we see, for example, that over almost 85% of school personnel are recommending guardianship before a discussion of any other type of decision-making support. Social services and medical professionals, which are other places that families are going to be, sort of having this conversation, often talk about guardianship before they talk about any other type of decision-making support. So while we have this sort of beginning change in the way that we think about supported decision-making and guardianship, we know that families are not necessarily getting a full range of information, so that sort of that train towards guardianship is continuing, and there's a shift, an effort to really try to shift the conversation. So supported decision-making is this idea that there are a whole lot of ways in which people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can be supported to make decisions. It's about relationships, legal arrangements, people who are in a person's life that can help them understand what they want to do and help guide them around decision-making. And nationally, it's really being talked about as an alternative to guardianship, is to enter into these and to really think about supported decision-making as an alternative. I would say that supported decision-making can happen no matter what decision-making tools are used. We want to make sure that we're always doing everything we can to understand what that individual's wishes and preferences are, whether there's guardianship or not. So just a little bit more about the big idea of decision-making. The information around brain development tells us that while we thought the brain, was sort of done developing at a fairly young age. We now know that it continues well into a person's 20s. 25 has sort of been a number that's bandied around. So we want to sort of be thoughtful about making decisions about something like guardianship when someone turns 18, because their capacity to learn and grow is still significant, and their ability to make decisions will change. And we might reflect back on our own experiences as we grew up. How many of us were making really good decisions at 18, 19, 20? But we probably learned a lot from those decisions that helped guide us as we continued along our paths. So there's no reason why someone with a disability wouldn't also make less than stellar decisions at a younger age, but develop some of the skills needed to do that better. So this picture is one way to help guide a conversation and thinking about decision-making, and this is specific to financial management or financial thinking about, managing one's finances. So a person-centered planning process might look at the different things in a person's life that they might have access to and look at their strengths, abilities, assets in each of those domains to engage in this case, financial management, using the tools that might be available to all of us in our communities as well as to that individual. So when you think about something like being concerned about someone not managing their money well, what is available to all of us to address that? So for example, can we set limits on our credit card account? Can we set limits on cash withdrawals from the bank? Can the bank provide some oversight about what's happening with an account, have an alert system that would then notify us if there was an issue? Can we use joint accounts so that a parent or family member might be able to help that young adult sort of monitor and manage their budget on a monthly basis and potentially intervene so that that account isn't overdrawn? So there's lots of tools that are available to all of us to help support decision-making and to manage our lives that aren't necessarily about using legal tools such as guardianship to prevent things from happening, right? So we always want to be looking at what is that person's strengths. Do they like to use technology? Might they check their account every day? Or do they need some other support around financial, for example, management? So these are just some ideas for how to go about that conversation and thinking about it in this one domain that might broaden what the conversation looks like. So I'm going to talk now about just what are some of the actual tools available to us to support decision-making. One of the ones that I found most important to be aware of is what's called a release of information or consent. So when a young adult turns 18, when they're 18 and 30 seconds, they are viewed differently under the law than when they were 17, 365 days and whatever. And one of the places that this matters a lot is around health care. So if there are people involved in that young adult's life, and often it's family members, who help with setting up doctor's appointments, making decisions about medical care, interacting with medical professionals, and that's important to continue, you have to do something. So while I may have had a relationship for 17 years with my son's specialist, neurologist, for example, that neurologist, even though they know our relationship, they trust me, they know my son wanted me to be a part of his life, they can no longer interact with me and share medical information. So you have to first be thinking, if you do nothing else, be thinking about what might the continuing involvement of family members or others, support people in that young adult's life, look like, and what do you need to make that happen? And this is true for any setting that you're interacting in. So it's healthcare settings, educational settings, vocational settings. All of those places are going to need you to sign, or your young adult, to give consent to you to still be part of the process. And then another level of designating who's involved and how they're involved are what are called powers of attorney. You can have powers of attorney for healthcare and finances. It's easy to do. The forms are available on the Department of Health Services website, and the link is at the end of this presentation. So powers of attorney also designate who might be part of making decisions around healthcare. So even if our child didn't have a disability, say they were in an accident and ended up in the emergency room and weren't able to communicate their wishes, you need somebody else to do that. So really, we should all be doing powers of attorney for healthcare and probably finances, right? It isn't just about disability. And then, as we go sort of through the list of options, guardianship is one that is sort of the most consequential in terms of the impact on that person's right to make their own decisions and or the designation of other people to have the right to do that. The last one I want to just spend a little bit of time on are what are called supported decision-making agreements. So has anybody heard of those? Raise your hand. Great. So supported decision-making agreements were passed into law in Wisconsin last year. So it's brand new. And it lays out a way for an individual with intellectual developmental disability to say who they want to be the support people in their lives and what type of support those individuals can offer. So they say how they want that support person to interact with others in different settings, and what role they want them to play. But it's the individual with the disability who is completing the form and designating who those people are. So, and agreements can be very flexible, but they do carry the weight of law. So if you're in a setting and you haven't yet encountered a supported decision-making agreement, you might want to find out how those are documented, for example, in the electronic medical record, and how you understand what authority is being given to that support person through a supported decision-making agreement. And as I said, the supported decision-making and supported decision-making agreements can be used in conjunction with any other type of supported decision-making tool, whether it's a release of information or guardianship. It can run the full gamut of both of those things interacting together. So because guardianship is so familiar, I want to talk just a little bit more about it. Again, sort of the national conversation is to really help us and ask us to start to think about this juxtaposition of human and civil rights that are guaranteed within our Constitution and the guardianship which removes many of those rights from an individual. And to rethink our immediate sort of advice to families when young adults turn 18 to automatically seek guardianship. One thing about guardianship is it doesn't have to happen at age 18. A family can explore other options and make a decision at some later date to pursue guardianship if they feel like that's needed. So there's not like a ticking clock for it, although many families are told 17 and 365 days you want to get in the court and get guardianship, but it doesn't actually have to happen immediately like that. So with guardianship, the court is involved. There's an attorney for the person with a disability called a guardian ad litem, as well as an attorney for the family, if that's who's seeking guardianship. And the court makes a determination of incompetence on the part of that individual. The court is supposed to consider if there are less restrictive alternatives available, such as some of the other tools that I had talked about, and increasingly there's education for judges and for attorneys on what this means, because there isn't really clear guidance in law about what that should look like. Guardianship can be temporary, although we know that typically when it's a decision of incompetence is made, it's much harder to reverse it than to sort of put it in place. So reversing guardianship is not something that is easy to do. And there can be guardianship of a person, of the estate, or full guardianship of everything. There's also the opportunity to limit guardianship, so you could say this individual still has the right to vote, to marry, to, you decide. It doesn't have to remove all of their rights to make their own decisions, but full guardianship does that. Basically says somebody else is designated with the right to do that, and can override that individual's choices about what they want to do with their life. One of the things that kicked off this discussion, wow, that's interesting, at a national level, I think I must have been working between two different versions of Word, of PowerPoint. Well, in any case, one of the things that kicked off this discussion at a national level was a case of a young woman with Down syndrome who was living in a group home and wanted to move into her own apartment. And her family opposed her wishes, and so she took it to court. And she eventually won her case and was able to reverse the guardianship, and she is now living in her own apartment with support. So that really kind of raised everybody's awareness about what is possible for people with disabilities and what people really can do when you start to look at young adults and their capabilities in our communities. The other thing about guardianship is it doesn't guard against bad decisions, right? It doesn't keep someone safe. We still can't do that even with guardianship. Young adults are still going to do things that will put them at risk. The court is supposed to look at what is that person's functional ability, not whether they make good or bad decisions, but their functional ability to understand choices, express their wishes about those choices. So if someone has no ability to express their wishes, that is concerning. And that might be a situation where we would be thinking about guardianship. But again, I think most people in my son's life would have said he isn't able to communicate his wishes, but people who knew him well could absolutely understand what his wishes were. He was very clear. He may have expressed them in different ways, but behaviors are certainly an expression of choices and preferences. So I want to talk just a little bit more about guardianship, since that's kind of the train we're trying to help us think more about and the thinking we're trying to shift. There are reasons that guardianship is important. So if a person is unable to make decisions and to give consent about what they want to happen to them in their lives, we need someone who can do that on their behalf, right? So particularly when you think about medical situations, I mean, there are lots of choices to make about whether or not to do something and whether or not to intervene. And as my son got older and he had opportunities to do surgeries that might improve his ability to function or just reduce pain, etc., more and more I began asking him, do you want to do this? You don't have to. It's your choice about whether or not you go through all the consequences of that. But if he weren't able to express that, then it's really important for those of us who need to do that on behalf of someone to do it in a very thoughtful and caring way. Similarly, along those lines, if someone is not able to exercise their rights, they need someone to help make sure that that happens, and to act as an advocate on behalf of that person if they can't do that for themselves. And to take action if that person is in a situation that isn't safe, or and to protect them from situations of abuse and neglect. So individuals need people in their lives who have the right to do that on their behalf if they can't do that for themselves. But there are also consequences to guardianship, both for the individual and for the way in which society sees that person. So a determination of incompetence can be really painful. I mean, think about so much of the experience prior to 18 can be a really strength-based approach. So our schools are helping young adults think about, what the future looks like and what they're able to do. Even starting in birth to 3, it's a very strength-based approach. Yet at 18, suddenly we're going to flip that and say, you are incompetent in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of society, and that can feel really bad. And that person may feel a loss of their own, self-respect, as well as the way in which society might look at them. So society might say, this person is less than because they are not considered competent to make decisions and may interact with them in a very different way. Similarly, along those lines, if a person isn't aware of their basic rights, then and how to assert them, it can put them at greater risk for abuse or exploitation. And if we want someone to be able to say no, we also have to accept the fact that they may say no to things that we think might be important in their lives, right? But saying no is really important in whichever way a person is able to do that and express their wishes. And sort of back to this idea of decision-making as a learned skill, if a person doesn't have the right to make decisions and doesn't continue to have experiences in their lives which let them do that, they may both lose the self-confidence to do that, as well as the learning opportunities that might improve their decision-making. So all of this is just meant as a way to put a bunch of ideas out there for you to think about as you support families and as families as you make decisions, or as individuals with disabilities as you make decisions about what does support look like as adults around decision making. And it's really individual. So not every person with the answer is different for every person who has cerebral palsy. No one person is exactly like another in this capacity, so it's a really individualized approach. These are a list of resources. I do want to point out we have a new issue brief through the Waisman Center on supported decision-making that goes into more detail about all of this and offers some resources. And there's also resources through the Waisman Resource Center around this topic as well. With that, I'll invite questions or comments from those who are here. Yeah.
Is there still a way to have some rights to do decision making, even if you have supported decision making, or the supported decision making people just do it for you, and you don't get any rights to do it?
Okay. So the question is there, do you retain rights as an individual with a disability to make decisions when you're using supported decision-making agreements and some of these other tools? So I would say almost all of the tools completely retain the individual's right to make their own decision. The only one that changes that significantly is guardianship. So guardianship is the one where the court actually says this individual doesn't have the right to make some of the decisions in their life. But limited guardianship can also designate some of the rights that that individual retains as well. Okay? Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions on the release of information when you have a nonverbal child/adult? She has a trophy on the box, but how do we, how does she fill that out so when she turns 18, we have the ability to still help with medical, et cetera?
Consent can be given in lots of different ways. So my son couldn't write, but he had a stamp with his name, right? And so in a setting where we were filling out a release of information, we'd fill it out, and then we could ask him, do you still want, and again, we want to use language that that individual understands. So, do you still want me to help you with your talk to your doctor? Is it okay with you if the doctor shares information? that individual can give consent in whatever way they communicate, right? It doesn't have to be verbal or written. And then they can sign in whatever way they would do that, whether it's a stamp, hand over hand, or there may be even other ways. Yeah, so there's lots of flexibility. The main point is that it's clear that they understand what they're giving consent to, yeah. In language they can understand, yeah. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Paige.
Thank you. I think this is a really, really important topic for us to talk about, the transition to adulthood. For families who are trying to, so certainly like I can provide data if guardianship is the direction that a family wants to go. But if families are trying to figure out whether to pursue guardianship or go down a different path, is there a phone number that families can call or a website or I don't know, something that families can use to kind of explore different options?
So kind of all of these resources are a good starting point, so for example, I would encourage a family to call the Resource Center. There's a Resource Center that serves the entire, resource centers that serve the entire state, and the staff there are versed in this topic and can help sort of have a guided conversation with families. The Wisconsin Guardianship Support Center is another place to call where you can talk to someone and really explore some of the nuts and bolts. And I think, though, also thinking about other professionals in that family and child's life. So, talking with teachers who the family feels like know that child well, or medical professionals who might be able to help with that. And again, it's something to explore. So the family can try other types of tools and see what works. I think another thing to do that might be helpful at this time is what's called a futures planning process. So part of that can include looking at what that person's what everybody's concerns are, what that person's strengths are, and start to map what to do in these situations, and then try other things before potentially looking at guardianship. But unfortunately, someone asked, and I would actually like to explore the possibility, is there a decision-making tool that says if this, then this, and help guide a family through that? I'm not aware of anything like that exists, but I'd also be cautious about it because everybody is so different. So take any disability, there's a really scattered skill set. And the consequences of that, it's really hard to know what the consequences of that scattered skill set are, right? Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things I do with it is the doctor has to support me a lot of the time, being competency,
Yeah.
certified incompetency, which is not pleasant. But I like the people with disability to know what the issues are on that and encourage people to look. It's published in the state of Wisconsin Cert Reports and look at what the doctor's going to discuss. Because some people have very strong feelings about voting or marriage, and they don't care about consent to participate in experimental medical treatment, which, the guardian probably needs to help more with that.
Right.
But then there's this middle category on that form, and I'm just wondering what the courts do. There's, yes, they need a guardian, no, they don't need a guardian, and yes, they could participate in this decision with guardian support. What does the court do with that middle category? Do you know?
So I'm thinking, so the question is, on the competency form that a physician fills out, there's a lot of different questions, and so Michael was suggesting in part it'd be interesting for anybody who is anticipating guardianship to actually know what the things on that form are. But I'm thinking, and then you asked about a middle category where there's options about what type of things that person can or can't do. So that's where I think limited guardianship comes in. So, for example, a person might decide to retain their right to vote, and might say, I don't care about consenting to medical treatment, or I want somebody else to make that to make that decision for me. So you can parse out what that person can continue to have the right to do and not.
The middle category with is like, yes, the person can make the decision, but only with the agreement with the guardian. And I don't know what that means. Do you
for some things that are.
It must be very confusing to the judge to read that, right?
I don't know. I would have to ask how judges handle that. But my basic understanding is that's where the limited or full guardianship decisions are made, is around those things. But that prompts me to go back and look at the form. And
Because that's that new question that started about 8, 10 years ago,
Okay.
that they put that
Um,
intermediate category in there. It's not just yes and no, there's a space in the middle.
And I know they're also trying to add some additional questions that lead to this thinking around supported decision-making on the competency form. And I expect we'll be,
Again, the people doing this, you're just trying to do your best, but nobody really gives you any guidance on going through that, like what you're talking about. There's some better way to channel
Yeah.
people to the most appropriate answer for that individual.
there is work being done sort of across disability partners to provide education and training. It's real around sort of supported decision-making, but I think it would be really helpful to have one that focuses on physicians who are trying to fill out that form and add some additional clarification, because my understanding is you really don't get any support, but you ask Holly, what do you do when you get these forms and how do I fill it out? Some additional support might be really helpful.
That's what the physician talking about. I just at least include the person with disability in the
Yeah.
decision-making around these decisions. Maximize their range of what we're doing. I worry that people have lives and won't even include the person with disability in any of the discussion.
I think you're right.
At minimum, the guardianship needs to be a joint process.
And then I think the conversation with physicians needs to also include the differentiation between shared decision-making and supported decision-making, because shared decision-making is kind of talked about, I think, in the medical world these days, with regard to just including the patient in the process of their care plan versus the difference with supported decision-making, because if they don't understand the difference, then that's going to impact what their decision is and how they proceed.
So the comment that shared decision-making is sort of a best practice in the medical profession, no matter who you're supporting, right? You want that patient to be as knowledgeable about what's happening and to engage in a discussion about what happens with their care. And that should happen no matter what, whether a person has guardianship or any other type of supported decision-making tool. But then you're right, there's actually legal documents that have a different, it's really about who makes the decision, not the discussion you have with the person about what's going to happen. So they are two very different things, yeah. Well, with that, thank you very much. I'm happy to chat afterwards if folks are interested, and I'll turn it over to Teresa to tell us what's next. Thank you.
We're going to transition to our panel discussion portion of today. It'll be the last portion of our time together this morning. So I just want to invite Stacia, our community member, and then the clinicians who will be a part of this panel to come down. And I don't know if anyone had any questions that they wrote specifically on those little pieces of paper. If so, I can collect those now. Otherwise, it's an opportunity for you to ask any remaining questions that you may have that you want to direct specifically towards either Stacia or one of our clinicians. But if our clinicians could come forward, that would be lovely. And Stacia, too. No, but actually, I'll put it on the table. Yeah, if anyone has any questions. It's okay. There you go. So I'm just going to ask our clinicians to just briefly give you their name and their field. You know our two presenters.
Mary Locast, occupational therapy for the Cerebral Palsy Clinic.
Betsy Zahn, physical therapist for the Cerebral Palsy Clinic and outpatient pediatric clinic in Middleton.
Lori Matzdorf, I'm speech therapist in CP Clinic and also a therapist over at the Middleton Clinic.
I'm going to go ahead and do an introduction for Anastasia. No, do you have one ready? She's going to introduce herself, actually.
Hello, I am Anastasia Wilson, and I am honored to speak to you today.
And I'm Abby. I'm another speech language pathologist in the Cerebral Palsy Clinic, but I also work in the Communication Aids and Systems Clinic, so my focus is on augmentative communication.
All right. Were there any specific questions? We'll just open it up to either follow-up questions to any of our speakers or any specific questions for our clinicians.
Well, the way it's set up is that the school therapist is the primary therapist and that any other therapies are secondary to that. So we always recommend having access to getting communication between the therapists in the outpatient and in school setting so that we can share the IEP goals and share our goals so that there's no duplication of goals, because duplication of goals is what's going to stop them from getting outpatient therapy services. And then a lot of the school-based goals should be related to access to their education, and the outpatient goals can be much more medically based, like, you know, getting a certain amount of strength or certain functional activities, certain range of motion kind of things. And yeah, in the home and the community, and you guys are then focused on the school. Do you have any other
You know, with the advent of coverage, at least right now, for habilitative care, usually I'm recommending that families call their insurer, check their benefits. If there is a benefit for habilitative care, they're really focusing on that piece. And as Betsy alluded to, trying to make the case for the outpatient therapist, focusing their goals very pointedly on functional skills for in the home and in the community. And we absolutely, as Betsy alluded to, also encourage communication between the school and the outpatient therapists, because then insurers want to see that collaboration just so that there's carryover across environments, but also to avoid the duplication piece where possible. I also want to leave room for the fact that we do have families who during the school year adding in additional appointments can be tricky, especially if they are focusing really heavily on having their children attend regularly, getting all their academics in and being really academically competent. There's the after-school piece to focus on that. So adding in those appointments is tricky. And not all these guys can speak well to families who would really love could I have the appointments after school? Well, those fill up really fast. So being able to come out of the school environment to drive and attend a 10 o'clock in the morning appointment and come back, then the child is also like, what happened? I left and I came back and there was a gap in time. So it's very complex, I'm sure. And Summers, yeah, I'll let them speak to Summers.
Yeah, summer therapy would be an ideal way to kind of supplement what's going on in the school program and then work very, very focusedly on some of the skills that you need to be able to perform in the community, in the home, without having to worry about the added duplication of services problem. But you do also have to be aware that if you want to do therapy services over the summer, that's something you need to start thinking about early in the spring, say like March or April. Because it can be very difficult to get into the outpatient clinic unless you plan way ahead. There's medical assistance or insurance prior authorizations that need to be done, and those can take up to 3 months to do. So if you think if you're thinking about making a referral for some supplementary therapy services over the summer, it's good to be thinking about it as early as February.
Just from the therapy end too, if you look over the past 10 years and that you're taking 3 months to get approval to do therapy, I mean, how is that, is another piece of why the people aren't getting the outpatient therapy. How hard is it now to get 40 therapy visits compared to 10 years ago?
It's a lot harder.
And it depends on the insurance company. I mean, if we have some insurance companies, if you're a contracted provider, that there's a fairly streamlined process, but then there's many others that it's hoops and hoops and hoops and hoops. And I'm sure you have your own unique perspectives too. I'd love to hear if there's any families in the audience who have any thoughts on how they navigate school along with outpatient. We'd be happy to hear from you too. Anybody want to venture?
I would also say too, more recently, MA has been a little bit better. If we're pretty clear about our goals being different, that they have actually been a little bit better and a little bit faster in getting services authorized. So that has improved over the last year.
Yeah, and there's a streamlined process for kids under 6 that's a little more generous. Over 6, there's still a few extra hoops to go through, but we'll see where that goes.
I got usually a pretty good voice, but oh, okay. I was gonna say sometimes the providers. We had a provider that just refused to because they're like, no, it's supposed to be done through the school, and it's like, what are you supposed to do with that when the provider refuses to provide?
Kind of a different one.
Yeah.
That's bad.
And I wonder if they're just thinking that they wouldn't get it approved, but I would probably look for someone else then. Oh, yeah, that's very unusual.
I think one of the other aspects that can sometimes be limiting is that the providers who are available for summer therapy services fill up pretty quickly, and the access to actually getting into the clinic can sometimes be the obstacle.
I would comment too, related to your comment about the outpatient therapist saying they couldn't do it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what their reasoning would have been, but for us, a lot of times we talk about the very contrived environment in an outpatient setting. So as augmentative communication specialists, we see how important it is for the strategies that our clients are working on to be carried over everywhere. And Stasha can speak to this, as you're learning to communicate via a system like this, doing it in a clinical setting can be really helpful for that focused, one-on-one piece. But then the carryover is so important. And so I think one of the things we talk about a lot with our families is the goal is not for them to come to therapy with us for months and months and months on end. The goal is for us to coordinate with their teams in their school and their home and their community so that everything we're working on in therapy is carried over into their more natural environments with their more common and familiar partners.
And just to second that, I often will say to families, if you're getting close to the end of the school year, ask your therapists, like, what would be your top 10, and that might be all of the therapists combined, not 10 for OT, 10 for OT, 10 for speech, but what might be the top 10 list, and then look at what might be ways that we can get this in when we are doing the things we're going to do this summer. They might be doing some therapeutic horseback riding, they may be doing some yoga, they may be doing some rec programs through the park district, and finding ways to emphasize those top 10 more skills or more activities within what they're doing, because then families feel like, boy, the head hit the pillow, and they're like, we got it in there, without feeling like they necessarily had to say, were we able to schedule a formal outpatient therapy visit?
I was wondering if, for any of the panelists, you have you could share any successful strategies at starting the conversations around transition and at sort of what age. I know you see an age range of patients and have an age range of experiences, but just, and it may depend on functional issues or whatever, but like, if there's anything you can share about what's a good time to start talking about?
Real quickly. I'm sorry, keep going. So Stasha's just getting a comment ready for the last question, the last topic quickly, and then we'll go to that one if that's okay.
It'll make the therapy fun for the kids, so they won't do it.
Motivation is such a big piece, right? Yeah, making sure that they're interested in the therapy and it's relevant for them. Yeah, good point, Stasha.
I think one of the important things, without any timeline on transition, is that the healthcare providers are talking to the children so that they develop a language so they know what their diagnosis is and why do they take a medication that they participate in. So that's a slow process, right? But if we don't work at those components of decision-making, as we were talking for a long time, and treating the children as people, because unfortunately when people have communication impairments and they don't get addressed as a person, they're talking to the person next to them as if their mind is over there, right? So that's the other, getting some experience and practice, and that's a long, it's much, that's the 18-year process, is talking to the people as people. But then more specifically, you want to address guidelines on transition?
Just a little side before I talk about specifics. I liked Liz's comments about working with kids all the way through on decisions they can make. Kids can make decisions at most ages they are. Children are making choices and framing those as, oh, that's a good choice. Oh, I like the choice you made, and framing it in that wording. Also, having people be a part of their communities their whole life, because I say to families all the way through, ultimately you are a part of your community, and when school is over, whether that's 18, 19, 20, 21, you will be a part of your community, and having families feel empowered to be out in their communities, part of their communities, known in their communities, because that is going to be one of their main supports later. Formally, as we're talking about little things, but we start formally talking in clinic at around 14 for sure, where we're starting to, families kind of, their eyes sometimes pop out like, well, what are we talking about? But we're trying to get them looking into resources, feeling comfortable when I ask, do you have a transition plan page on your IEP, and what does that mean, and how does that look? And that isn't a document you have to fill out and know everything you want to know for your child when they're older, but it's a evolving part of the IEP and how your team can help you with that. And then there's so many more resources than there were even, Amy can agree with me or not, 10 and 20 years ago, for families to be looking at, and trying to get those pieces of paper or websites or links in their hands, because I always joke with my families who've known me, it's great late night reading. Sometimes it'll put you to sleep. But I try to say, try to start going through things and put Post-it notes where you have questions, so that when you can meet with your healthcare providers or come back to clinic or with your therapist, you can be asking these questions. So much easier to unfold it and unpack it over years than, oh my gosh, they're going to be 18 in a few months. What do we do? It's a big transition and a big amount of things to do, but it can be so much more stressful if you're trying to take it all in right away than over time. So we try to unpack that as we go and provide information between 14 and up through 18 and then 21, trying to keep pace with some of the changes. This new supported decision-making change has been a nice advent, but also changes in pediatric to adult systems have changed too. So, and school districts, I'm sure, are doing their best to keep up with that too. It used to be that many things changed at 21 and now some more at 18 and unfold through 21. So parents have a lot on their hands, but trying to be partners with them and some of that lingo and connecting with resources seems to be ideal if we can do it.
And I think also there's been changes in healthcare information and how that's given, and at 12 now, there is some information that families do not have access to, and they can't even see our reports now at age 12 unless they get special permission. So there are lots of things happening at much younger ages now. And I don't know, Dr. Ward, if you talk about that whole piece of that in clinic as well, because 12 seems like really young to me.
How did you learn about that? You've had that. Yeah, well, that accessing information.
Well, usually when you go onto the website, you have to have like a consent thing and have me switch it over so that I'm on her information. Otherwise, it won't. Huh?
Was that easy?
Yeah, it was kind of easy. Yeah. At first, I was like, "What? I can't even look at my daughter's thing," but I had to consent to actually be able to do that or whatever, and then switch it over because otherwise it would just pop up on me first. There'd be nothing there, and then after I did that, then it would pop up to her information so I could see what was going on with her stuff.
And everywhere you go for healthcare, you have to do that again.
Not necessarily. I mean, only one time I went to the doctor, the woman asked me for the consent form for her, and I said, for what? Not consent form, the guardianship papers, and I'm like, for what? And she goes, well, when she turns 18, you have to change guardianship or get guardianship for her, and I'm like, she's only 15. And she's like, oh, well, never mind. And I'm like, that's why I was kind of freaked out when I'm like, this is my child, and now I gotta do that. But I've talked to parents because I work with people with disabilities too, and I've talked to other parents about what they had to go through. And one of the parents told me that that's the hardest thing for them to do is to go into court and say my child is incompetent and I have to take care of them. So I'm learning a lot of different things. I asked the clients' parents different things that goes on with them. So that kind of helps. And then when I go to the Wiseman Center, you guys tell me a lot of stuff too. Help out a lot.
I think too, and I'm glad Dr. Mission is here, we will regularly be talking about neuropsychological testing at those key, starting at 7, 8, and trying for plot points throughout, especially as it's nearing transition. And that is a discussion that we have. We try to put out the best information we can and link people, but it's always families' choice if they want to pursue that extra information or that additional information and what that may mean. Those reports, maybe you can speak to whether those are part of the family's record and confidential, and who they're shared with. But we welcome as much information as we can get to help families with that process.
My parents treated me as a normal kid, and they wanted me to make my own decisions, and they wanted me to be independent as possible.
So I think for Stasha, Liz's comments about creating those opportunities, that was important for your learning, would you agree? And for your independence?
Julie, did you have
thank you for speaking to your experience. I think creating those opportunities as much as possible and kind of getting creative with what that looks like. And it doesn't have to look specifically like OT, PT, or speech services, but thinking how can we engage the child in their community in the day-to-day. I think ultimately, certainly is my goal in working with families, and certainly meeting the children where they're at, Another piece with doing the neuropsychological testing, I always want to give families the space to hear information independent of the child, but then following up in future appointments or scheduling a second feedback, for example, where the child is also very much a part of getting the information, I think is really an important part. And then the report too that we do produce is we're within the UW system, so it's accessible for all the providers and folks who are a part of the child and the family's team. But that report is then the family, the child owns that report, so then they're able to share that however they feel would be helpful. So whether that's with school or other stakeholders in the community.
Related to that kind of idea of making sure kids all the way up through adulthood are really involved in decision-making in their communities, Stasha has a comment or some information about her experience in school. That's probably relevant.
I was mainstream for most of my schooling. I loved it. My grade school treated me as a normal kid, and they saw my potential. My classmates loved me. I was so popular that they had to assign seats to sit by me at lunch. When my mom heard this, she was worried that nobody liked me. My teacher said, "Oh, no," and had to explain.
She has another area that she wants to share about too.
I want to tell you an important story. I have dyslexia. When I was growing up, when I was trying to read, the words just looked as if they were a batch of groups of letters without meaning. Sometimes, I would study the vertical patterns that were between the words. I tried my hardest to read, but I just couldn't. I felt embarrassed and so dumb. My grade school teachers couldn't figure it out. They knew I was very intelligent on the rest of the subjects. I was in a couple of classes for learning disabilities for reading and math. I didn't mind because I knew the teachers were really trying to help me. When someone read the books to me, I understood the content. Therefore, I was mainstreamed for all of the rest of the classes. We thought it was just a part of my CP, and if I worked hard enough I would to be able to read. Since I can't physically talk, the sound of each letter just runs together in my head. Often, I start spelling a word with its last letter because I remember the last sound of a word. Nobody really realized that I had dyslexia until I went to college at Whitewater. They called it a reading disability, and they showed me the coolest tool that their students use. They had a computer program that would read the textbooks out loud while highlighting the words, so I could actually follow along. I was surprised when my reading got better, and now I can read short paragraphs without help. In high school, DVR misdiagnosed me with an intellectual disability. They gave me a test. They accommodated for my physical disabilities, but they didn't accommodate for my learning disabilities. They tested me on reading manually, but they did not test my comprehension of the material. Standardized tests has their place if used correctly. However, they can be quite dangerous if people are trying to decide a student's future, because the tests only show a slice of a person's intelligence. To make a long story short, I worked day and night to get accepted to UW Whitewater to cast off the wrong label. With a lot of hard work, I graduated cum laude.
That's great, Stasha. I think that speaks well too to kind of related to that supported decision-making idea, is that with the right supports, you were able to show that you don't have an intellectual disability, and you have to know what's happening in a person's profile and their skills and their needs so you can really support them to be as independent as possible, because you have accomplished some really amazing things. Thank goodness that you worked so hard to get to where you are now. Other questions?
I think that's a high note. Yeah. And I think we can top that.
So thank you again to our presenters, and then especially Stacia and our clinician panel.